Looks like everybody had a very nice day this day. The others missed out. Serve them right for going home early, isn't it? Yes. Yes. Very nice. Well, having one side is a little bit better than why we haven't got two sides.
Are you cold?
No, but I don't want you to be cold because then you don't listen.
I have the balm of swimming and the warmth from all of that.
Well, as long as you spread it across everyone else, that's the thing.
Don't worry, my cheeks.
Very nice. Very nice. I've got a tough question I'm going to ask you. I'd be interested to see if anyone knows the answer to this question. There are two chapters in the Bible that are identical. What books are they found in? Two chapters identical.
New Testament? No clue?
Well, I would like to think that you knew. A man of your experience and age.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Is one of them Psalms?
Yeah. He's really warm now.
I was going to say Luke and...
Well, if you say Luke, which chapter and what part of it in Luke?
Oh, come on.
Is Psalms the other one?
No, it's not Psalms. It's actually Old Testament, so that gives you a bit more of a clue. Isaiah is one of them, yes. Do you know what chapter?
53.
No, all right. Let's go to Isaiah 37. Now, that's fair enough. That's a tough question. I knew it would be tough.
No one's ever asked me that before.
Well, that's why you come to such a place like this, to learn more.
Absolutely.
Yes, that's lovely. Now, this is a very interesting story that we're going to read about. Isaiah chapter 37. And verse 1, and this is what it says. And so it was when King Hezekiah heard it, that he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. Now, obviously, there was a crisis, and we're just reading about the crisis. And he tore his clothes. That was a thing that they did back in those days when they got really distressed. They tore their clothes and usually put sackcloth on and went into the house of the Lord. Now, if you come back to 2 Kings, which is toward the beginning of the Bible, 2 Kings, this time chapter 19 and verse 1. It says, and so it was when King Hezekiah heard it, that he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. Now, if you take the time to go through those two chapters and compare them, you'll find them word for word. What would that suggest to you?
Not very important at all.
You'd expect that from an American, wouldn't you? Good dog. Yeah. Well, obviously, probably one copied the other. But why would have God allowed it to be recorded twice? Yes, because it's very, very important. The story that we're going to study tonight is very, very important. Because obviously, when it comes to the study of the Bible, only some things are recorded. Not everything was recorded in the Bible that happened, is that right? Yes. And God has selected those things which would be helpful to the church down through the years to be recorded in the Bible. Obviously, there are lots of other things that happened, but God didn't see fit for those to be a lesson for God's people down through the years. But this story is recorded twice. Now, if we go back to 2 Kings 17 and we read here, we get the background to chapter 19, the ones that are recorded twice. So we need to get that. What's the background? 2 Kings 17 and verse 1 says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea the son of Elah became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. Now, there's something we need to notice about when we're reading the Old Testament, particularly the second and third part of the Old Testament, and that is Israel was divided into two sections, wasn't it? There was the 10 northern kingdoms, which are referred to as Israel, and the two lower tribes, Judah and Benjamin, that are referred to as Judah. So this story is starting off in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah. All right, so he's the king of the southern kingdoms, Jerusalem and so forth. Hoshea the son of Elah became king of Israel in Samaria. So there's two kings here, reigning concurrently. One reigning over the northern kingdoms and the other over the southern kingdoms. And things were pretty bad because verse 2 says, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. That's the one in the 10 northern kingdoms, Hoshea. Did evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute money. So because of the rampant apostasy in Israel, the 10 northern kingdoms, God allowed the Assyrians to come down and to take them captive. And the king of Assyria uncovered a conspiracy by Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year after year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. So that was the situation. It's giving us just a historical background to the great events that we're going to read about now. So it's important just to understand the setting of what we're going to study about. The trouble is that verse 13, if you read on, it says, yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all his prophets, every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes according to all the law which I commanded your fathers and which I sent to you by my servant the prophets. In other words, God was saying that I have sent to Israel and to Judah my prophets, and they're to keep the commandments. But the trouble is, as we read on in verse 16, says, so they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, made for themselves a moulded image and 2 calves, made a wooden image and worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. So things were pretty bad because they were simply copying the other nations and they had gone into rampant apostasy. And verse 18 says, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah alone. That's the 2 nations with Jerusalem as its capital. And then verse 19 goes on to say, and also Judah did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the statutes of Israel which they had made. So like a plague, it spread down into Judah. The apostasy or rebellion up the northern kingdoms now was seeping down into the southern kingdoms. And it's in a time like this, if we go to 18 now, chapter 18 and verse 1, it's in a time like this that King Hezekiah comes to the throne. That's why it's important to read this background. Apostasy was rampant everywhere. And chapter 18:1 says, now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hoshea the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. And he was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, and the daughter of Zechariah. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places and broke the sacred pillars, cut down the wooden image, and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the children of Israel burned incense to it and called it Nethshutan. Now you imagine, remember the story of the snake? And that had become an idol to them. And finally Hezekiah smashed it because they looked to it instead of looking to the God behind. And verse 5 says, he trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor who were before him. That would suggest to me that he was a pretty good man. Is that right? King Hezekiah, a good man. The best king that Israel ever had. You know, position magnifies a man's strengths or his weaknesses. You know, people say, what a dreadful person Adolf Hitler was. Well, it's true. But I think there are plenty of people, even here in Western Australia, that would be equally as bad if they had the power and the position. Do you think that that could be true? There are plenty of people given the same opportunity that Hitler had who would be just as brutal as he was. Because human nature. And so what we're saying is position magnifies either the man's strengths or his weaknesses. And in this case, it's Hezekiah's strength. And he stood out like the rock of Gibraltar among the mountain tide of apostasy that was sweeping everywhere and everyone. Hezekiah stood by the truth of God. Now, the Assyrians at this time were the leading country in the world. And today you can go to the British Museum. Anyone been to the British Museum? It's the best museum in the world, let me tell you. And the good thing about the British Museum is the fact that you can take your camera in and take pictures, including flash. Now, if you've done much museum hunting around the world, you'll know that usually you can't take a camera in, and certainly not a flash. But the British, thank the Lord for the British, they discovered so much good stuff. We love the Americans too, don't worry, but this is the British got hold of all these relics and particularly archaeology and so forth, and they took them over to the British Museum, and it's marvellous, the things that they have. And I think really from a point of view of history that the British Museum is the best in the world. And the Assyrians had come down against them, and today you can visit the story that we're reading in the Bible is actually in the British Museum, because you can go down to the Assyrian room. Now, the Assyrian room, when you enter it, it's on the bottom floor of the British Museum, and when you go into the room, you have these giant bulls that are on either side, which would have been on either side of the entrance to Nineveh, because Nineveh, you remember, was the capital. On either side of Nineveh, as Jonah and so forth would have walked into Nineveh, he would have gone past these two bulls. They're huge. How they got them over there and on their ship and then put them in the British Museum is a marvel in itself. But you can walk in, and when you walk into what is called the Assyrian room, there you can see the story that we're reading here in the Bible is actually recorded in stone on the walls of Nineveh. And it says there on the walls that you can read in the cuneiform, because the Assyrians wrote in cuneiform. That's that, I don't know how to describe it. Yes, it's not hieroglyphics. The Egyptians were the hieroglyphic people. Geometric, yes, it's like they got a chisel and into the stone. And It's so well preserved, of course, that today we can still read it. Those who have studied the ancient wording can read it just like you and I read English. And so today the whole thing is open to us. And I just think it's marvellous that you can go into the British Museum and actually see the story that's recorded here in the Bible. Have a look at verse 14. This is chapter 18 and verse 14. It says, "Then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish." Now let me just explain. Lachish is a mound, is a what they call a tell in archaeology. It's a high hill. We couldn't call it a mountain, but it's quite a high hill. And it was erected, or they used it as a lookout in those days. Samaria, you've heard, Samaria was the capital city of the 10 northern kingdoms, and it had a protection called Megiddo. Heard of Megiddo? You've heard of Armageddon. Well, that's where it comes. Megiddo was the protection for the 10 northern kingdoms. Lachish was the protection for the 2 southern kingdoms. Get the idea? Now, already, when we're reading this story, the Assyrians had conquered Lachish. So there was not much left to conquer except Jerusalem. And they would have controlled the then known world. And he sends a letter to Hezekiah from Lachish saying, "Listen, you might as well open up the gates of the city because I'm coming down to take Jerusalem. And if you want to preserve your life and save the lives of your people, open up the gates and there'll be no war." That's the letter that he wrote to Hezekiah from Lachish. And he said, "Don't you think that your God will protect you, because he hasn't protected the 10 northern kingdoms and he's not going to protect you either. So throw open the gates." Let's read a little bit more here as it goes on, as you read through the rest of the chapter. And Hezekiah was very, very concerned, and obviously so, because that's why chapter 19, remember, the 2 chapters that are identical, starts, because if you have a look at chapter 19, verse 1 says, "And so it was, when King Hezekiah heard it," that is, he got the letter from the king of Assyria, "that he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord." Not a bad place to go, is it, when you have trouble? And Hezekiah took the letter that Sennacherib wrote, and he laid it on the temple and kneeled down and tore his clothes, showing that he was so concerned and stressed about this whole thing, and he prayed. And as you go through, you'll find that this is a beautiful prayer that Hezekiah prays. And in fact, if you have a look at chapter 18 and verse 35, 18:35, it says here, part of the letter that Sennacherib wrote. It says, "Who among all the gods of the land have delivered their countries from my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand?" Can you see what he's saying? No one else has protected, no other God has protected them from my hand. Don't you think that your God is going to protect you either? Verse 26 or 36. "But the Lord held their peace and answered him not a word, for the king's commandment was, 'Do not answer him.'" That is, Hezekiah said, "Don't answer him." You know, I'm amazed at people, and you meet them too, I'm sure, just like I do, who laugh at prayer. And they scoff at the idea that why would you waste your time talking to some fairy in the sky? But it's an amazing thing. When people get into trouble, the first thing they do is to pray. I can almost guarantee that if you were to pick up the paper and someone was lost, The newspapers, the television stations would be encouraging everyone to pray. Even secular newspapers and television stations, radio stations, still today, whenever a crisis comes, they still talk to us about praying for these people. And you often hear references to prayer when people are in trouble. You know, there's a saying that came out of the Second World War when these Allied soldiers were fighting up there in Guadalcanal, you know, in the Solomons. And the Japanese were strip bombing the Allies, and the Australians, New Zealanders and the Americans were down in these trenches that they call foxholes. And they were cowering down there, and the Japanese, with their little midgets and so forth, were coming down and strip bombing these what they call these trenches or foxholes. And the saying that came out of the Second World War was this: there are no atheists in foxholes. Ever heard that statement? Well, it comes from the Second World War, because every one of those soldiers, and you can imagine, they didn't know whether they'd be alive or dead the next minute, were all praying. And it's marvellous how suddenly people want to pray when they're in trouble. And so Sennacherib begins to pray, and it's not really to his credit to pray, because anyone would pray in the situation that Hezekiah was in. But notice what he says when he does pray, because it's very interesting. It says, "Now therefore, O Lord our God, I pray, save us from his hand." Well, you and I would pray that too. And then he gives the reason why they were to be saved, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are the Lord God, you alone. So what was he praying for? Was he praying merely to save his own skin? What was he praying for? Yeah, God's glory, that's right. Exactly. He was praying that God's name would be honoured among all the nations around. And God answered his prayer, because if you come down to verse... it's a very beautiful prayer. We haven't got time perhaps to read all of it. But if you come down to verse 35, this is chapter 19, 35, it says, "And it came to pass on a certain night that the angel of the Lord went out and killed in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when the people arose early in the morning, there were the corpses all dead." I always smile when I read that. Have you ever seen a live corpse? It says they're all dead. So how many were there? How many is that in the text? How many?
185.
Yeah, how many is that? 185,000. One angel wiped the whole Assyrian army out. You know, we ought to think and pray and talk a lot more about the angels than we do, because we're told that all of us have a guardian angel, don't we? The angel of the Lord encamps about them that fear him and delivers them. And we ought to have a lot more said about the wonderful work of the angels. But you imagine the king, Sennacherib, has his whole army wiped out by one angel. And he had a long time to think about it as he trooped back to Nineveh, about 600 kilometres. And he didn't drive a car, so it was over a number of days. He had a long time to think about it. And when he got back to Nineveh, he called his gods and so forth, his priests, high priests, and he said, "How is it that I lost my whole army?" Oh, they said, "It's very easy to explain. The father of Hezekiah was a man by the name of Abraham. And Abraham was willing to offer his son to their God. And Sennacherib began to think about that. And he said, I've got 3 sons. Let's read what happens next. Verse 36, it says, So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went away, returned home, and remained at Nineveh. Now it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the temple of Nisroch his god, that his son Adramelech and Sharezer struck him down with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat. Then Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. Now what happened is this, that as Sennacherib thought about what had happened as far as Abraham is concerned and offering his son to their God, he thought, I've got 3 sons. If I offer them to our God, then I'll be invincible. But the trouble is the boys got to hear about it, and they got rid of father before he got rid of them. And that's how we understand this, the rest of this the story. And with this amazing deliverance has just taken place. I mean, you just imagine the effect of the whole of the Assyrian army wiped out. And 185,000 of them. And then the next news that comes to Hezekiah is found here in the 20th chapter and verse 1. In those days, Hezekiah was sick and near death. And Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, went to him and said to him, Thus saith the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die and not live. You imagine, after this amazing deliverance, God says, get your house in order because you're going to die, Hezekiah. Now, do you think that Hezekiah wanted to die? He certainly didn't. And he cried and went on with Isaiah, the prophet. And as you read in verse 2, he turned his face toward the wall and wailed and prayed to the Lord, saying, Remember now, O Lord, I pray, this is verse 3, how I have walked before you in truth and with a loyal heart, and have done that which was good in your sight. And Hezekiah wept bitterly. We can all identify with this. And it so happened before Isaiah had gone out into the middle court that the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Return and tell Hezekiah, the leader of my people, Thus saith the Lord, the God of David your father, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears, surely I will heal you. On the 3rd day you shall go up to the house of the Lord. And how many years did God add to Hezekiah? 15. Yeah, we remember the story. And Hezekiah still wasn't happy, because what did he ask of the Lord? Even though Isaiah had gone back and said the Lord has changed his mind, what did Hezekiah say? Yeah, I want a sign. And what was the sign that he wanted? Yes, the sun went back 10 degrees, which means if the sun went back today, when it rises in the morning, and then you put the sun back, what would that do to the day? Make it longer. That's correct. Yes. So the day was longer. Now, just before we comment a little bit about that, I want to ask you, do you know how old Hezekiah was when this happened? This is interesting. How old was he? Does anyone know? He was actually 39 when this happened. Now, he was entering really the best years of his life. Pastor? In the 40s are the best years of your life. I knew that would please you. Yes. Good news. Yes. There was a book written some years ago called Life Begins at 40. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but let me tell you the philosophy of the book. The philosophy was, up until you're 40, You've still got your youth. But in those years, you've learned a few things. And so with your youth, you're still now able to put into practice what you've learned up until the age of 40. You get the idea? Now, I think it's got a lot of merit. I think that the philosophy of the book is probably fairly correct. I don't know whether life begins at 40, does it? Got to reach that time yet. I'd like to think so. Anyway, Hezekiah, 39, entering the best years of his life. And God says, get your house in order because you're going to die. And then God says, all right, I'll answer your prayer. And Hezekiah says, I want a sign. And God gives him a sign and puts the sun back 10 degrees. Now, who do you think that made an impression with? Putting the sun back 10 degrees. Who would have noticed that? Yes, particularly the Assyrians and the Babylonians, because what did they do with the sun? They worshipped it. And much of the mathematics that we have today has come to us from the Babylonians. You know, the Bible talks about the wise men of Babylon, and indeed they were wise. And in Australia, we have gone over to the decimal system, and most of us find the decimal system, because we've been educated now with the decimal system, although some of us learned the old imperial system, you know, the 12 times table. And some of you still remember learning the 12 times table? And we talked about miles, and we talked about inches. And young people today, if you talk about miles, they've got no idea what you're talking about. Inches, they can't visualize that. Well, it was the Babylonians that worked all, basically our mathematics that we use today, originated with them. For example, their system was based on number 6. And that's why when you get to the book of Revelation, you find the man at the head of the Babylonian power with a number 666, because 6 was their number. And they worked out a system that's even better than the decimal system, because the decimal system is divided by 2 and by 5, isn't it? But the 60 system, which was what they based it on, is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, which even makes it easier to deal with. And it's interesting that at the same time that they chose 6 and 60 as their system, and by the way, if your mind immediately goes to Daniel 3, you'll remember how high was the image that they made. Do you remember? 60 cubits, wasn't it? By 6 cubits. Because this is, once you understand this mathematics, you can see it all through the Bible. Now, at the same time that the Babylonians had the number 6, God's number was number 7. And that's why in the Bible you have the number 7 that's stamped through the Bible. You've got 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 overcomes, 7 plagues, 7, 7, 7. And not only is it in the Bible, but it's also in nature. We have 7 seas. How many colours in the rainbow? 7. How many notes on that keyboard? 12. In an octave. Because the octave that's here on the keyboard is repeated a number of times, depending upon how big the keyboard is.
Octave is 8, but if you take the following octave, it's 7.
It's 7, isn't it?
Yeah.
There are 7 notes in music. 7 colours in the rainbow. 7 seas. And many of the animals and birds' gestation periods are multiples of 7. Now, did this happen by accident? No, it's all been designed by a master designer. And it's interesting that if you add together 7, God's number, and 6, the devil's number, what number do you get? And what's 13 considered to be? Very unlucky, isn't it? I mean, the average secular person, 13, especially if it's Friday the 13th, has no idea. They'll tell you that 13 is unlucky, and you ask them, why do you think 13 is so unlucky? Well, they've got no idea. It's just considered to be unlucky. Because we've lost it in the past, the linkage between people from time immemorial have recognized that if you mix together the things of God and the things of the devil, you've always got problems. And that's where it comes from. And it was the Babylonians who worked all this out. And the reason they were able to work it out is because they studied the movement of the sun. They were sun worshippers, as we know. And for example, the pyramid. If you were to put a compass point on the top of the apex of the pyramid, and then you ran the compass, the arm around, it'll touch exactly the 4 points of the pyramid. Now, is that just an accident, do you think so? No, they understood 2 pi r long before Pythagoras ever discovered it. And because God gave these people tremendous brains because they were closer to the beginning of time, and as time has gone on, we've deteriorated more and more. But the further you go back in history, despite what evolution says, we are getting smarter and smarter, not dumber and dumber. And so this is interesting. Here, God shifts the sun back 10 degrees. So that made a tremendous impression upon the Babylonians. And they heard that it was the God of Hezekiah that shifted their God back. So they sent a delegation over to Hezekiah to find out about this God of his that's able to move their God. And I want you to notice what poor Hezekiah did. Chapter 20 and verse 13, I think, is it? Chapter 20 and verse 13 says, and Hezekiah was attentive to them. Now you can imagine. You know, the leading nation in the world, sending their leading doctors and leaders over to sit at Hezekiah's feet, and he had a swell head. He was attentive to them and showed them all the house of his treasures, the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious ointment, and all his armory, all that was found among his treasures. There was nothing in his house or in all his dominion that Hezekiah did not show them. What happened to poor old Hezekiah? How much did he talk to them about the Lord? Does he mention the Lord? Not a mention. Instead of that, he said, fellas, look, come over here and I'll show you all the armory that I've got here. Come over here and look at all the gold and the silver I've got. And he opens up and shows them that. And he spent all his time showing them all his treasures and what he has. In other words, he was boasting and saying, isn't this great Babylon that I have built? Not quite in those words, but that's exactly what he was doing. A mistake that Nebuchadnezzar was going to make a little bit later. And they said, well, thank you very much, Hezekiah. Remember, he hadn't spent a moment. Here, God gave him an opportunity to tell them about the God that can shift their God. Instead of that, he taught. If you look at the record, the text, it's his. In other words, all he was doing is telling them about himself. And if you read the record a little bit further down, you'll find that the men had only walked a little bit further outside from Hezekiah, and God said to Hezekiah, come over here, I've got a little talk to you. And he said, Hezekiah, everything you showed the Babylonians, they're going to come down and they're going to take the lot. And you know what Hezekiah said? Well, dear Lord, may it happen in my son's day, and may it not be in my day. Now, if I'd been writing the Bible, I don't think I would have put that in, because doesn't show Hezekiah up in a good light, does it? There's something else that happened to Hezekiah in these added years. He had a son born. In fact, if you have a look at chapter 21 and verse 1, Manasseh, it says, was 12 years old when he became king. So what does that mean? When was he born or conceived? When was it? Was within those 15 years. Isn't that right? In other words, what the great lesson, and one of the reasons I want to talk to you about this story and why it's been recorded in the Bible, is because of this. We think we know what's best for us. And Hezekiah, if Hezekiah had died when God wanted him to die, he would have gone down a perfect man. There's nothing recorded against Hezekiah until the added 15 years. And the big mistakes that he made in his life were all made in those added 15 years that God never intended him to live. And the lesson that I learned from this as I read this story is that's why we must always pray that God's will be done in our life, not what we think. Now, we always think we know what's best for us. Of course we do. But we don't. And Hezekiah's big mistakes, and if maybe if we've got time before we end our camp here, if you think that Manasseh was not a bad fellow, wait till I talk to you about it. The worst man that ever lived was King Manasseh. And he was the son of a good King Hezekiah, whom God said there was no king better than him. Yet he gave birth to this wretch of a man that did just dreadful, dreadful, dreadful things. You would hardly believe it until you read the record of Manasseh. And he should never have been born. Hezekiah should never have lived those 15 years. Manasseh would never have been born. And furthermore, he would never have made the mistakes of the tragedy of Israel when the Babylonians came down and took the lot. And remember, that was the time of Daniel, and so forth. So these stories have not just been recorded to fill in space, and the fact that this has been recorded twice shows me that God regards this story as very, very, very important. And it's a hard lesson for all of us to learn. And I was just thinking about the fact that the Babylonians and what they did to Israel, and you're familiar, we've all read the book of Daniel, and we know the story of how God used the Babylonians to punish Israel because of their apostasies. And I also often wonder, when people come over to visit us, I wonder what we do if God has blessed us with a nice house or a nice car or this or that or the other thing, and people come over to visit us, what's the impression that we give to people? That by my might and by my wisdom and my this and my that I've been able to achieve this? or do we give the Lord the honour and the glory? I remember hearing, when I was up in North Queensland many years ago, I remember hearing about a cattleman up there whose cattle were outstanding. And he began to hear about the Adventist message. And as he began to study, he heard about the tithe. And he said, at the time I heard about the tithe, I was really struggling financially. And his family were telling him he's mad and fool and all the things that families say. And he said, I went back to the Bible and I read it and I became convinced that this is what God wanted me to do. And God blessed that man to the extent that for hundreds and hundreds of kilometres in every direction, the cattlemen would come in to study his methods because his cattle were so much superior to everybody else's. And he said when they came down to talk cattle, he said for the first half hour I talked cattle. Then he said I talked how the Lord had blessed me. And I told them my experience with following the Lord. That's why God could bless that man, because he didn't take the credit to himself. And there's a great lesson, I think, that we all need to learn, that it's not by might and by power. If God has seen fit to bless us in one way or another, we need to be extremely careful how we deal with that when it comes to telling other people. And because what's the impression that we give them? You know, through our might and our abilities and our acumen and our smartness that we've achieved this, or do we give the Lord the credit? And I think that this is a very important point for us all, because the natural tendency is for us to take the credit to ourselves. And I've often thought about Hezekiah too. You imagine this guy, after doing all these things, then when God says to him, I'm going to bring the Babylonians down, he says, well, may it not be in my day, may it be in my son's day. Sort of doesn't show him up in a good light, does it? And so one of the lessons also we need to learn is that the best of men are only men at best. And that's why some folk over the years have been caught up by following some individual, because in the Adventist church we have had people arise from time to time, and folk have been foolish enough to want to follow them. And they've finished up in tragedy. I just about, as I think back over the years that I've been an Adventist, and I can think of names of individuals that I could name now who rose up, and today they're all in oblivion. You know, if I mention Shepherd's Rod, some of you may remember. Then we had Nicolisi. Then we've had, I said the Shepherd's Rod, didn't I? The Davidians, yes, we know the sad story of what happened over in America. Well, they have an Adventist background, unfortunately, and it's from Australia. They have that even though they went over there to America, but it originated here. And then, of course, more recently, we've had fellows like Desmond Ford and so forth. The people all finish in oblivion. And that's why we must follow the only Superman there is, the Lord Jesus Christ. You know, I heard of a grandparents who went over to China some little time ago. And when you go over to China, one of the things that's you want to do when you go to China is to get some china. And if you get into these buses, these tourist buses, they take you to these factories where they make this stuff, and of course they want you to buy their gears. And the grandma, she saw a beautiful vase that just fitted her decor, and they bought this vase, and it was so delicate that they didn't even put it in their case. They kept it under their arm in the plane. And they got it home, and it was all safe and beautifully. And they placed it on the shelf, mantel shelf. And one day the grandson was over to visit. And he was at the stage of swinging on things. And the mantelpiece was just high enough for him with his hands up, and he was swinging. He didn't mean to, but he hit the vase, and it went on the floor and broke into hundreds of pieces. Well, what can you say? It's the grandson. But they were very upset about it. And so grandfather finally got some super glue, and he got every piece. It took him hours and hours, and put them all back together like a puzzle, you know. Put it back on the shelf, but all they could see every time they walked into it was these cracks. I don't know why it took them so long, but one day they were having lunch together, and they suddenly thought, we remember that when we bought the thing, that the lady said any time we want it anymore, just send over, and they'll send it over by post. Good idea. So what they did is they got the thing and they wrapped it up, and they still had a little card where they'd bought it, and they sent it back to the factory, and they wrote a letter and they said, we want one exactly the same as this one. See? Now, when you're a little Chinese that can hardly speak any English and you've got to look up every word in the dictionary, exactly the same, that's exactly what happened. And they made it so that they had the cracks and all in it. So when they finally, they were excited because there was a little note from the postman saying that there was a parcel at the post office, and if they went down they could collect it. And so they went down very excited. At last it had arrived, and then they opened it up. And
You like looked at me?
I thought
Looked at me like I had a bug on me. It was just a big beetle. I didn't know it was a beetle.
what do you think it was?
I thought it might have been something that can sting you.
Yes.
Like a wasp.
We have some very bad things here in Australia. Now, you interrupted my story. Where did I get to in the story? They're going to the post office, that's right. And they opened up this parcel. There was the vase, exactly the same as they sent it. And that's what happens, of course, when we follow some other human being, isn't that right? We get their mistakes as well as ours, and I reckon that's just too many for any of us. That's someone else's mistakes as well as ours. And so that's why we must look to Jesus. Listen to this statement from Desire of Ages. She says here, the Holy Spirit never leaves unaided the soul that is looking to Jesus. If we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the work of the Spirit ceases not until the soul is conformed to the image of Christ. That's beautiful, isn't it? And my prayer tonight is that God will help us to look to Jesus and not to make the mistakes of Hezekiah, and to recognise that we must understand and pray in our prayers that God's will be done. And that's very hard to pray that prayer when we are praying about someone's recovery from sickness or someone's recovery from some other problem. We must always still pray God's will be done. As I said, it's a hard lesson to learn sometimes, very hard. But this story has been recorded to teach us that important lesson. Let's just bow our heads in prayer. Father in heaven, I just want to thank you tonight for the story of Hezekiah, a man who you said was the best king of Israel, and yet he made some mistakes. And I pray, Lord, that you'll help us to recognise that the best of men are only men at best, and that our eyes must always be focused on Jesus. So bless us now as we go to bed, and bless us so that we can have a good night's sleep, and then raise us again to serve you tomorrow in our opening meeting at 7:15, I pray for Christ's sake. Amen. God bless you then. We'll see you